Okay. Friends, we are meeting after about a month, I think. I don't remember exactly. October 27th was probably the last lecture I gave. நம்ம இது வரைக்கும் ஒரு 3 lectures on the Indian economy நம்ம நடத்தியிருக்கோம். அதாவது we covered the period from 1950 to 1990. விடுதலைக்கு பிறகு வந்த முதல் 40 ஆண்டுகளில் எப்படிப்பட்ட பொருளாதார வளர்ச்சி இருந்தது, அதனுடைய பல்வேறு அம்சங்கள் என்னன்னு நம்ம சுருக்கமாக பார்த்துருக்கோம். அதில் குறிப்பிட சொல்ல வேண்டியது, மீண்டும் உங்களுக்கு வந்து ஒரு ரெஃப்ரெஷர் என்ற முறையில் ஒரு நினைவுபடுத்தக்கூடிய வகையில், ஒன்று அந்த 50 to 90 எப்படின்னா ப்ராடாக 50 to mid-60s 66 வரைக்கும், 66 to 80, 80 to 90 பிரித்தோம். அப்படி பிரிப்பினுடைய நோக்கம் என்னன்னா, 50களில் நம்முடைய விடுதலைக்கு பின்னான வளர்ச்சியை நாம் துவக்கும் பொழுது இருந்த உலக சூழலை நாம் புரிந்து கொள்ள வேண்டும் என்பதற்காக அது விரிவாக சொல்லப்பட்டது உங்களுக்கு. எப்படி முதல் உலக போர், ரஷ்ய புரட்சி, மேலை நாடுகளில் பெரும் வீழ்ச்சி, பொருளாதார வீழ்ச்சி, அதைத் தொடர்ந்து 2ஆம் உலக போர், இந்த பின்புலத்தில் ஏராளமான நாடுகள் 45க்கு பிறகு காலனி இயக்கத்திலிருந்து வெளியேறக்கூடிய வாய்ப்பு அதிகரித்தது. மேலை நாடுகளுடைய வலுவான நிலை என்பது தொடர்ந்தாலும் பலவீனப்பட்டது. இந்த 2 யுத்தங்கள் இடையில் வந்த பெருவீழ்ச்சி இருந்ததால மறுபுறம் எந்த வெளிநாட்டு உதவியும் இல்லாமல், இன்னும் சொல்லப்போனால் மேலை நாடுகளுடைய அச்சுறுத்தலை எதிர்கொண்டே செயல்பட்ட சோவியத் ஒன்றியத்தினுடைய மிக பிரமிக்கத்தக்க பொருளாதார வளர்ச்சி என்பதும் அதனுடைய சமூக அம்சங்களும் போல பொருளாதார வளர்ச்சியில் பல கஷ்டங்கள் இருந்திருக்கலாம், ஜனநாயக உரிமைகள் பற்றி பிரச்சனைகள் இருக்கலாம். பட் பெரிய அளவிற்கான ஒரு பிரமிக்கத்தக்க பொருளாதார வளர்ச்சி என்பது எல்லா நாடுகளிலும் ஒரு தாக்கத்தை ஏற்படுத்தியது. விடுதலை பெற்ற நாடுகளுக்கு அங்கே துவங்கக்கூடிய வளர்ச்சி பாதையில் சோவியத் உதாரணம் ஒரு முக்கியமான உதாரணமாக இருந்துச்சு. அந்த பின்புலத்தில் தான் வந்து பல நாடுகள், மேலை நாடுகள் உட்பட, பொருளாதார வளர்ச்சியில் அரசின் முக்கிய பங்கை அங்கீகரித்தனர். அந்த அடிப்படையில் நம்முடைய முதல் 15 ஆண்டுகளில் நாம் 3 ஐந்தாண்டு திட்டங்களை நிறைவேற்றினோம். அந்த காலகட்டத்தில் 5 திட்டங்கள் பொதுத்துறை என்பது முக்கியமாக இருந்தது. இது வந்து சோஷலிச நாடுகளைப் போல் அல்ல, ஒரு பிரைவேட் கேபிட்டலிஸ்ட் எக்கானமி. இந்தியாவை பொறுத்தவரை பெரும்பாலும் ஒரு தனியார் பொருளாதாரம் தான். அது அரசனுடைய பங்கு மிக குறைவு தான், எப்பொழுதுமே குறைவு தான், நேரு காலத்திலையும் குறைவு தான். நேரு காலத்தில் அதிகமாக இருந்தால் சொல்கிறாங்க இல்லை. தொடர்ந்து இந்திய நாட்டின் மொத்த உற்பத்தி மதிப்பில் இந்தியாவினுடைய அரசுகளின் செலவுகள், மத்திய மாநில செலவுகள் ஒரு மொத்த உற்பத்தியில் ஒரு 1/4 அதுக்கு குறைச்சும் கூட்டின்னு தான் இருந்த வழியே பெரிய அளவுக்கு அதிகமாக இல்லை. இது பல மேலை நாடுகளை விட குறைவு. அமெரிக்காவே வந்து ஒரு மோர் தென் 1/3 ஆஃப் ஜிடிபி வந்து சென்ட்ரல், ஸ்டேட் அண்ட் லோக்கல் கவர்மெண்ட்ஸ் செலவழிக்கிறாங்க. இந்தியா அதை விட மோர் ப்ரைவேட் தன் யூஎஸ்ன்னு சொல்லணும். பட் ஸ்டேட் ரெகுலேஷன் இருந்தது. ஸோ இந்த முதல் 15 ஆண்டுகளில் அரசு பல்வேறு சட்டத்திட்டங்களை உருவாக்கியது. ஒரு முக்கியமான கட்டமைப்பு துறைகளை அது வளர்த்தது. ஃபைனான்சியல் செக்டர், எஜுகேஷன், ஹெல்த், பவர், டிரான்ஸ்போர்ட் அண்ட் கம்யூனிகேஷன்ஸ், இப்படி முக்கியமான துறைகளில் அரசுடைய தலையீடு வலுவாக இருந்தது. பெருமளவுக்கு முதலீடுகளை மேற்கொண்டது அரசு. ஏன்னா தனியார்கள் இந்திய நாட்டில் வந்து அந்த அளவுக்கு இப்படிப்பட்ட துறைகளில் முதலீடுகளை மேற்கொள்ள தயாராக இல்லை. ஏன்னா நீ லாபம் உடனே கிடைக்காது, ரொம்ப வருஷம் ஆகும். இதெல்லாம் அரசாங்கம் பண்ணி கொடுக்கட்டும் நமக்கு, அது அரசாங்கம் பண்ணி கொடுத்தோடனே நம்ம அதை பயன்படுத்திட்டு நம்ம வளரலாம் என்ற அதுதான் பம்பாய் பிளானும் அதுக்கு அடுத்து வந்த மேலே நம்முடைய பெரு கம்பெனிகளுடைய நிலைப்பாடும் அதுதான். அந்த வகையில் அரசியல் வேறுபாடின்றி அரசின் பங்கு அங்கீகரிக்கப்பட்டது. பொருளாதாரத்தில் அரசு பங்கேற்கணுங்கிறது. அந்த அடிப்படையில் ஒரு 3 அம்சங்கள், 3 முக்கியமான காரணங்கள் இந்தியாவின் வளர்ச்சிக்கு உதவியாக இருந்தது 50களிலிருந்து 80 வரை. ஒன்று, பொதுத்துறை முதலீடுகள். இது இந்த நான் சொல்லக்கூடிய 50-80 காலத்தில் 2ஆம் பகுதியில் சஃபர் ஆச்சு, கட்பேக் இருந்தது பப்ளிக் இன்வெஸ்ட்மெண்ட். அது ஒரு லாங் ரிசெஷனையும் உருவாக்கி இருந்தது நம்ம பார்த்துருக்கோம். தென் இம்போர்ட் சப்ஸ்டியூஷன், இறக்குமதிக்கு மாற்றாக உள்நாட்டு உற்பத்தி. 3வது ஒரு எல்லைக்குட்பட்ட நிலை சீர்திருத்தங்கள். இந்த 3மே வந்து உள்நாட்டு சந்தையை விரிவடைய செய்தது. டொமஸ்டிக் மார்க்கெட் எக்ஸ்பேண்ட் ஆகிறதும், டிமாண்ட் கிரியேட் ஆகிறதும், அதை ஒட்டி சப்ளை எக்ஸ்பேண்ட் ஆகிறதும் என்று ஒரு டிமாண்ட் லெட், கவர்மெண்ட் இன்வெஸ்ட்மெண்ட் லெட், கவர்மெண்ட் ரெகுலேட்டட் ஒரு கேபிட்டலிஸ்ட் பாத் ஆஃப் டெவலப்மெண்ட்டில் நம்ம பயணித்தோம். இது கேபிட்டலிஸ்ட் பாத் ஆஃப் டெவலப்மெண்ட் என்பது நம்ம அண்டர்லைன் பண்ணி சொல்லணும். இது முதலாளித்துவ வளர்ச்சி பாதை தான். இதில் சோஷலிசம் என்பதெல்லாம் ஒரு இம்மியளவு கூட கிடையாது. அரசின் பங்கு இருந்தது. அரசின் பங்கு எதுக்காக இருந்தது? தனியார் நிறுவனங்கள் லாபகரமாக செயல்பட வேண்டும், பொருளாதாரத்தில் தனியார் நிறுவனங்களுக்கு தேவையான கட்டமைப்பு வசதிகளை அரசு உருவாக்கி தர வேண்டும். இதெல்லாம் வந்து அவங்க முதலீடு செய்ய முடியாது. சில விஷயங்கள் அரசு பொறுப்பேற்று செய்யணும். கல்வி, ஆரோக்கியம், ஒரு சில கட்டமைப்பு வசதிகளை அரசு பண்ணி கொடுக்கணும். அதே மாதிரி வெளிநாட்டு போட்டியிலிருந்து உள்நாட்டு முதலாளிகளை பாதுகாப்பதற்கு அதற்கு ஏற்றவாறு இறக்குமதி ஏற்றுமதி வரி கொள்கைகளையும் சரக்குகளை அனுமதிப்பதில்லை என்பது போன்ற கொள்கைகளையும் அரசாங்கம் பின்பற்றியது. ஒரு ப்ரொடெக்ஷன், ட்ரேட் ப்ரொடெக்ஷன் ரெஜிம் இங்கே இருந்தது. இதெல்லாம் பேசிட்டோம் ஏற்கனவே. இந்த காலகட்டத்தில் உலகமும் அப்படி இருந்தது. உலக நாடுகளில் வந்து எக்ஸ்போர்ட்ஸ் அதிகரிக்கிறதுக்கு நமக்கு வாய்ப்புகள் குறைவாக இருந்தது. அதுவும் நம்ம மேலை நாடுகளை அதிகமாக நம்பி இருந்ததுனால அங்கு ஏற்றுமதிக்கான வாய்ப்பு குறைவாக இருந்தது. நம்ம வந்து வளரும் நாடுகளோடு அதிகமாக மூவ் பண்ணியிருந்தோம்னா அது ஒரு வேறு நிலைமையாக இருந்திருக்கலாம். ஆசிய நாடுகளே ஒன்றுக்கு பரஸ்பரம் பண்ணியிருந்தாங்கன்னா அது வேறையாக இருந்திருக்கலாம். அப்படி நடக்கலை. உலகமே வந்து மேலை நாடுகளோடு பிணைக்கப்பட்டிருந்த மாதிரி இருந்தது. முதலாளித்துவ உலகம் முழுவதுமே வலுவான 7 மேலை பணக்கார நாடுகளோடு பிணைக்கப்பட்டிருந்தது. அதான் அன்றைய நிலைமை. இன்றைய நிலைமையிலையும் அது பெரும்பளவு உண்மை. அப்போ இந்த பேக்ரவுண்டில் we embarked on a path of development and achieved significant growth rates in agriculture, industry and services. 50களில் 60களில் by mid-60s, இந்த ஃபர்ஸ்ட் பிளான் பீரியடில் இண்டஸ்ட்ரி grew at about 8% per annum. வரலாற்று காலான வளர்ச்சி இந்தியா இருந்தது. அந்த 8% growth rate மட்டுமில்லை, டைவர்சிஃபிகேஷன், பல புதிய துறைகள் உருவாகின. மிஷின் டூ, பவர், உங்களுக்கு இந்த ஃபிகர்ஸ்லாம் ஏற்கனவே கொடுத்துருக்கேன். அந்த நான் அனுப்பக்கூடிய டெக்ஸ்ட்லேயும் அது இருக்கும். நான் டெக்ஸ்ட்டையும் பவர் பாயிண்ட்டையும் இப்போ நான் யூஸ் பண்ணலை. என்ன பண்ணால் நம்ம டிஸ்ட்ராக்ஷன் ஆகும். அதனால் ஐ வாண்ட் டு ஃபோக்கஸ் ஒன்லி ஆன் தி நேரேட்டிவ். நான் சொல்கிற கதையை முதல்ல கேளுங்க, இந்திய பொருளாதாரம் பற்றி கதையை. பிறகு அந்த விவரங்களை நீங்கள் அந்த குறிப்புகள்லையும் பவர் பாயிண்ட்லேயும் படிச்சுக்கோங்க. ஸோ ஐம் கோயிங் டு ஃபோக்கஸ் ஒன்லி ஆன் நேரேட்டிவ் ப்ரெசன்டேஷன் to avoid the distractions of a PPT. I saw some of you put comments saying அதையும் பார்த்தா நல்லா இருக்குமே. அனுப்பிடுறேன், உங்களுக்கு அனுப்பிச்சிடுறேன், நீங்கள் உங்களுக்கு வரும், பார்த்துக்கோங்க. ஸோ டுடே just briefly summarizing what has happened, we went through the 50 to 80 period with some difficulties in the second half, which I have discussed, especially brought about by cutback in public investment and devaluation of the rupee, successive oil price increases in the international economy. இதெல்லாம் சேர்த்து பல சிரமங்களை நமக்கு உருவாக்கியது என்பது உண்மை. மறுபக்கம் ஓரளவுக்கு வெற்றிகரமாக நடந்தது இந்த இரண்டாவது ஃபேஸ்லங்கிறது கிரீன் ரெவல்யூஷன். அதனுடைய துவக்க 15 ஆண்டுகள். அதில் மிக முக்கியமான பங்கை அரசு ஆற்றியது. அது ஒரு சந்தை சார்ந்த சாதனை அல்ல என்பதை நான் உங்களுக்கு கோடிட்டு காட்டிருக்கிறேன். அதாவது அரசு எப்படிலாம் உதவின்னு வரும்பொழுது விளைபொருளை கொள்முதல் செய்வது, தக்க விலை கொடுத்து அந்த கொள்முதல் செய்யப்பட்ட தானியங்களை நாடு முழுவதும் கொண்டு சென்று பாதுகாத்து பராமரித்து விநியோகம் செய்வதன் மூலமாக சாதாரண மக்களுக்கு தானியங்களின் விலையை கட்டுப்படுத்தி ஒரு கட்டுப்படியாக விலையை கொடுக்க முடிந்தது. ஸோ ப்ரொக்யூர்மெண்ட் அண்ட் பப்ளிக் டிஸ்ட்ரிபியூஷன், மினிமம் சப்போர்ட் ப்ரைஸ், குறைந்தபட்ச ஆதரவு விலை மட்டும் பல விமர்சகர்கள் ஆகாது வேண்டாம்லாம் பேசுகிறாங்க. புரியல அவங்களுக்கு. எம்எஸ்பி, ப்ரொக்யூர்மெண்ட், பப்ளிக் டிஸ்ட்ரிபியூஷன், இந்த மூன்றும் ஒன்றுக்கொன்று இணைந்தது. இப்படிப்பட்ட ஏற்பாடு தான் இந்திய நாட்டை காப்பாற்றியது. 70களில் 80களில் ஒரு மக்கள் தொகை பல மடங்கு அதிகரித்தாலும் கூட நம்மால் அனைவருக்கும் உணவு கொடுக்க முடிந்திருக்கிறது. கொடுத்தோமா என்பது வேறு, கொடுக்கல, அதுக்கு அரசியல் பொருளாதார காரணங்கள் இருக்கு. ஆனால் அவுட்புட் இன்க்ரீஸ்ட் ஃப்ரம், ஃபார் எக்ஸாம்பிள் டு கிவ் யூ ஒன் ஃபிகர், food grain output was around 55 million tons in the 50s, 5.5 crore tons. Today it's more like 300 million tons, close to 300 million tons, 30 crores. So, a 5-fold increase over a 70-year period. So, it is not correct to think of MSP, procurement, and public distribution as a problem. They are a solution to our problems. அதை ஒழுங்காக நடத்தணுங்கிறது வேற, அது எஃபிஷியண்டாக இருக்கணும், அது வந்து தில்லுமுது இருக்கக்கூடாதுங்கிறதுலாம் வேற. பட் unless you assure farmers of decent prices, especially Indian context, வந்து எல்லாம் சின்ன சின்ன விவசாயிகள் இன்னும் இன்னைக்கு வந்து அதெல்லாம் அந்த கட்டுப்பாடெல்லாம் நீக்கிட்டா உடனே மான்சாண்டோ வந்து இந்திய விவசாயிட்ட, அரை ஏக்கர் விவசாயிகிட்ட பொருள் வாங்குவான்னு நினைக்கிறதுலாம் அபத்தமான சிந்தனைகள். Obviously we needed strong support to agriculture. Came in the form of land reforms, came in the form of expansion of power and transport and energy to the countryside, education to the farmers. Then the Green Revolution came. A very important change, because Green Revolution brought technological change. Earlier, Dhani Urpati Adhikaritado, Velan Urpati Adhikaritado was primarily through expansion in area cultivated and to some extent through increasing yield on account of irrigation. But technical breakthrough came only with the Green Revolution, where the government support came in the form of, as I said, procurement at MSP and rural distribution, but also in the form of National Farm Research System, nationwide agricultural extension system, which provided help to farmers in the field in terms of tackling pests and other problems. Then the expansion of institutional credit, ஒரு நிறுவன ரீதியான கடன் வழங்குதல் என்பது கந்துவட்டிக்காரங்களையும் பெரிய பெரிய மணி லெண்டர்ஸையும் பின்னுக்கு தள்ளி ஓரளவு ஃபார்மல் கிரெடிட்டை நம்ம விவசாயத்துக்கு கொண்டு போக முடியுது. விவசாயிகள் வந்து வரலாற்றையே பேங்க்குள்ளே போயிட்டு இருக்க மாட்டாங்க. மறுபடியும் இப்போ பேங்க் பிரைவேட் செக்டர் போச்சுன்னா அதே நிலைமை தான் வரப்போகுது. as long as பேங்க்ஸ் அண்ட் பப்ளிக் செக்டர், விவசாயிகள் கூட பேங்க்குக்கு போக முடியும். நீங்கள் HDFCயில் போய் ஒரு விவசாயத்துக்கு முடியுமா இன்னைக்கு 1/2 ஏக்கர் விவசாயங்கிறது நீங்களே கற்பனை பண்ணி பார்த்துக்குங்க. அங்கே போய் ஒரு ஜென்டில்மேன் ஃபார்மர் நகரப்பட்டில் வாழ்ந்துக்கிட்டு ஒரு 1000 ஏக்கரை பெனாமியாக வச்சுக்கிட்டு அவர் போகலாம். பட் சிறு குறு விவசாயிகள் HDFCலையோ ICICலையோ அதை உட்கார அந்த சேரில் உட்காரத்துக்கே யோசிப்பாங்க. அதான் யதார்த்தம். அந்த யதார்த்தத்தெலாம் புறக்கணிச்சு நம்ம இன்ஜினியர் வளர்ச்சி பேச முடியாது. யதார்த்தமாக பேசணும்னு சொன்னால் பொதுத்துறை வங்கிகள் நாட்டுடைமையாக்கப்பட்டது ஒரு மிகப்பெரிய பங்கை ஆற்றியது. கிரெடிட் எக்ஸ்பான்ஷன் கேம். கோஆபரேட்டிவ்ஸ் ஆல்சோ பிளேட் அ ரோல். இன்புட் சப்சிடிஸ், இடுபொருட்களுக்கான மானியங்கள், இது மின்சாரமோ உரமோ, இன்றைக்கு வந்து அது எல்லாமே ஆபத்துக்குள்ளாக இருக்குது. இன்றைக்கு வந்து மின்சாரத்துறை சம்பந்தமான ஒரு புதிய மசோதா சட்டமாயிருக்கு அப்பொழுது. அது வந்து விவசாயிகளுக்கு மானியம் அளிப்பதையே அது வந்து ஒழிக்க போகுது. அப்படின்னா அதுதான் ரொம்ப அபாயகரமான நகர்வுகள் என்பதையும் வரலாறு நமக்கு சொல்லிக் கொடுக்குது. மறந்துடக்கூடாது இன்றைய கான்டெக்ட்லங்கிறத நம்ம புரிஞ்சுக்கணும். பட் எனிவே தட் இஸ் நாட் பார்ட் ஆஃப் தி earlier history. ஸோ 70s 80s 70s எண்டு வரைக்கும் இப்படி ஒரு ப்ரொசீஜர் நம்ம போயிட்டு இருந்தோம். Overall record 50 to 80, about 3.5, 4% growth rates of GDP. Some diversification of industry. Significant growth of food grains output at a rate higher than the rate of growth of population. These were the achievements of the 50 to 80 decades. There were many problems, obviously, and I indicated to you that one major contradiction, ஒரு பெரிய முரண்பாடு என்னன்னா, ஒரு பக்கம் வளர்ச்சியை நிகழணும், அதுக்கு அரசு முதலீடுகள் தேவை. ஆனால் அரசு அதே நேரத்தில் உற்பத்தி பண்ணக்கூடிய பொருட்கள் எல்லாம் கொஞ்சம் மலிவான விலையில தனியார் கொடுத்தா தான் தனியாரால் லாபம் ஈட்ட முடியும். இந்த ஒரு முதலாளித்துவ உடன்பாட்டுக்குள்ள சிக்கிக்கிட்டு தான் பொதுத்துறை நிறுவனங்களால் லாபம் ஈட்ட முடியாத ஒரு நிலைமையும் ஏற்பட்டிருக்கு. அது பல்வேறு காரணங்கள் இருக்கு. வெறும் பொதுத்துறை இனிஃபிஷியன்சி சொல்றதெல்லாம் வந்து ஒரு சூத்திரமான பேச்சு, அது உண்மை அல்ல, ஃபார்முலாய்க்கு அப்ரோச். அது ஏராளமான ஸ்பெசிஃபிக் ரீசன்ஸுக்காக சப்சிடைஸ் பண்ணுறோம், கிராஸ் சப்சிடி கொடுக்குறோம். ஸோ பப்ளிக் செக்டர் என்டர்பிரைசஸ் ஷுட் நாட் பி ஜட்ஜ் ஒன்லி இன் டர்ம்ஸ் ஆஃப் கமர்ஷியல் ப்ராஃபிட்டபிலிட்டி என்பதை நம்ம இன்டெலிஜென்ட்டாக எவ்ரி திங்க் பண்ணும்போது மனசில் ஞாபகம் வச்சுக்கணும் அப்படிங்கிறத நான் சொல்ல விரும்புகிறேன். Anyway, all these are issues that we'll keep coming back to later again and again. So essentially 50 to 80, 4% growth rate of GDP, more or less 3.5 to 4, diversification, some amount of self-reliance of the Indian economy. Many problems, of course, unemployment and so on, inflation. These are problems. The poor, the most central feature is that land stealing laws were only implemented in a couple of states like Bengal and Kerala, and to some extent Jammu and Kashmir, but nowhere else in the country. So, adnala land concentration, extreme inequality in land holdings, increasing landlessness in the countryside, increasing the small extent of holdings for most farmers. All these are problems that come with us, and therefore the incentive to invest and transform agriculture has not always been present. Some amount of incentive did come with the Green Revolution. That's why Green Revolution saw growth of agriculture. But sustaining that has been a challenge. Okay. Now, so far we managed it, but not well enough. 80s were a different ball game altogether. End of 1780, you will recall I had said we had a crisis similar to the 65-66 crisis. Deep, steep fall in food grains output in 1780, thanks to a drought. There was also a lot of confusion in government. There was a period of transition. And there was also, therefore, a sharp reduction in the growth of GDP. a sharp rise in inflation because of the shortage of grains, and a balance of payments crisis brought about by 2 rounds of oil price increases in 73 and 78, precisely at a time when we were becoming increasingly import intensive in the economy, especially in agriculture, where we were importing petroleum feedstock for producing fertilizers, etc., etc. So, and of course, we were using diesel and petrol in all our transport, and agriculture consumed a lot of it, quite a good part of it. So, our export did not expand. Of course, the one saving grace was with the rise in petroleum prices, there was a boom in the Gulf countries. And some Indians got jobs there, and therefore they sent home money. That was a big help to us in terms of meeting our balance of payment difficulties. Nonetheless, by 1780, we had those 3 problems: a food crisis, foreign exchange crisis, and again the government being unable to sustain investment because of the lack of resources, which essentially comes from, I would say, the class character of the government, which is unwilling to tax the rich and relies primarily on indirect taxes for raising resources. Even now, as I have repeatedly told you in the last 4 lectures, something like 2/3 of the total tax revenue of the government of India and all the state governments put together comes from indirect taxes, taxes that ordinary people also pay on the same basis as the rich for anything they buy. Now it's become all GST, but earlier it was, excise duties, customs duties, sales taxes, etc., etc. Everything you buy had taxes in it. You didn't see it; they were part of the price, so that's why you call them indirect taxes. But the ones who could afford to pay taxes, the ones who have a lot of wealth and income, they were relatively lightly taxed. Although on paper sometimes rates would look very high, but like exemptions are there and all that. And so today, when a rich person says, I'm a taxpayer, so I'm entitled to whatever I'm getting, that's a bit hollow, because the bulk of the taxes in this country are being paid by ordinary people through whatever they buy and consume. The rich also pay taxes, but to a much, much smaller extent, because they're much smaller in number as well. And in the more recent period, there has been even lighter burden on the rich. Okay, that's a part of the story we'll come back to again later. In any event, by 1980, with our threefold crisis, Mrs. Gandhi comes back to office as Prime Minister, and then the world has changed substantially, as I said in my earlier lectures. The world where capital flows are becoming more important. So India is in a position to access some capital flows from abroad, and one of the first things we do is to take a big loan from IMF as part of the management of the balance payments crisis we faced in 1980. And then slowly in the 80s, India liberalizes in order to attract and be eligible for borrowing from international financial institutions like IMF and World Bank. We follow what are called structural adjustment programs, where we cut back the role of the state, increase the space for corporate private sector activity, both Indian and foreign. It's very important to understand this. This private is a very nebulous term. Your neighborhood grocer is a private sector agent. Half an acre farmer is a private entrepreneur. Fellow who runs a tool shop in his house with his children as the laborers is also an entrepreneur. He's running an enterprise. Okay, he's a businessman. He's a private sector person. But this is not the private sector that the government policies are helping. Government policies are helping the very large private sector, like Ambani's, or Adani's, or Tata's, or Birla's, on that scale. And of course, this is even much smaller compared to the global giants who, today in a globalized world, are able to compel most governments to invite them or to provide them all sorts of incentives, saying that if you don't do that, I'll go somewhere else. So the power of the large corporation, both global and domestic, especially global, of course, but also domestic, is so large now that policy is dictated essentially by their interests. And this has been the case for some time, but in the 80s, we still had a significant presence of government through the 80s. So we had path in the 1980s, which where government expenditure increased significantly in order to promote economic growth. Because the whole critique of the 50 to 80 economic development experience is only giving us a 5% or 4% rate of growth, and this is much lower than the 3.5% rate of growth. This is the Hindu rate of growth and all that. So we can be like South Korea, we can be like Taiwan, we can be like Singapore and Hong Kong. Of course, it's a bit silly because Singapore and Hong Kong are city-states. They are like Besant Nagar or some other part of the city. Hong Kong, South Korea and Taiwan are a bit more comparable, but of course the big elephant in the room was China. China was much bigger and doing so much better from the 80s onwards, from late 70s onwards. So anyway, the notion got around that in order to achieve higher growth rates, India had to try and export more. And in order to do that, India had to liberalize its imports and so on, but also provide more space for private players. In the 80s, this did not immediately imply reduction in the role of the Indian government. India அரசுடைய பங்கு குறையல, அவங்க இன்னும் எக்ஸ்பேண்ட் பண்ணாங்க, பப்ளிக் செக்டர் எக்ஸ்பேண்ட் ஆச்சு, பாம்பே ஹை வந்து நமக்கு கை கொடுத்தது, எண்ணெய் இறக்குமதி குறைக்க முடியுது. ஸோ 80ஸ்ல வந்து அரசினுடைய தொடர் செலவுகள், government expenditures, investments, along with import liberalization, made possible expansion of the economy, because import liberalization enabled the catering to domestic demand for imported goods and services, either directly or through the import of the machinery, capital goods concerned. So the 80s saw, as we saw last time, 80s saw rapid growth, about roughly 6% per annum on the average. And in that, the industrial sector also grew rapidly. And the agrarian economy did well. In fact, it did the best in the post-independence period. In the decade of the 80s, the agricultural output and food grains output grew at slightly over 4% per annum compound, and a record high historically. However, this expansion, and remember that the service sector grew even more rapidly than the agricultural and industry sectors, because the share of the service sector in GDP rose from 36% in 1980-81, 39% by 1991. So in fact, the service sector grew even faster. So generally, it was a period of rapid growth and quite impressive, balanced across sectors. However, this growth, remember, was financed primarily by expanding government expenditure. And the problem was that, how do you finance the increasing expenditure to enable the continuance of growth? And there again, you have a problem that the government cannot go on spending unless they can raise resources. And there the essential character of the government, its reluctance to raise taxes from the rich, puts limits on how much borrowing, how much investments can be made. Of course, we had the difference in the 80s, that unlike 70s and 60s, we had a somewhat greater access to international finance. And so we were going in the direction of making it more and more liberal in terms of access to the Indian economy for international finance, and also, of course, for international producers of goods and services who wanted to export to India. And we were hoping that this export by them to India would lead to a great export from India to other countries, but that didn't quite happen. And by the end of the 80s, this set of policies drove us into a corner where two major issues were identified by the government as being very difficult. One was the balance of payments crisis. Once again, 66, 80, 1991, partly, of course, the proximate impact of the Iran-Iraq war, and then later the Gulf War, with the US coming in, Iraq attacking Kuwait, and US responding by invading Iraq. All of that. So all this, really made trade very difficult, made for very high oil prices. So there were external shocks, no doubt. And then we had our own political instability, because by the 80s, the original political frame that India had which is essentially one party ruled by the Congress in most states except by the left in Kerala had broken through, and later the left front in Bengal in the late 70s. But otherwise, essentially it was a Congress, some regional parties, but Congress remained very powerful. So in the 80s, all that changed. Congress began to disintegrate, and that the counterpart of that is the rise of the BJP. So politically speaking also, there was a period of great ferment, and in the event, by the end of the 80s, there were considerable elements of political instability. We saw that Rajiv Gandhi had come into office with a massive mandate following the tragic assassination of Mrs. Gandhi at the end of 84. In the elections in 85, he won massively. But in 89, he didn't get re-elected. And the VP Singh regime lasted hardly a year. We had another dummy government for a while, backed by Congress. And then we had the 91 elections, which also did not throw up a clear verdict, except that the Congress was the single largest party and could later on manufacture support from some other parties and get a wafer-thin majority. So 91 to 96, Congress was in office on its own with a fairly thin majority. But the period 89 to 91 was therefore a period of great political instability. And this added to your sense of economic crisis. And it was at this time that the government of India diagnosed the crisis as essentially twofold. One was the problem of balance of payments, because India's exports were not expanding rapidly enough. But your import needs were expanding, especially with import liberalization. And therefore, you had to somehow get into a set of foreign trade policies that how that would happen, not clear. But one strong policy advocacy came from the liberalizers who said we should liberalize, we should open up the economy. Then foreign capital will come in, and they will come in and produce, and then they will become your exporters. They will export globally. India becomes the center for the global value chain. All kinds of fairy tale stories were circulated. How the elephant was now stirring and would soon overtake the tiger and all other assorted enemies, including China. That didn't happen is a different matter, but that was the image in the 90s. So it has been a recurrent theme in India, the politics of India. The economy plays a very big role from behind. So the use of China as kind of the Boji figure, as kind of some kind of you can make people mobilize by saying, oh, that's the Chinese economy growing, we have to grow faster than them. Good thing if you compete, but not bad, not a good thing if you're using it as a promotion of anger and this hatred among people. No, but in the economy, yes, it's good to have a competing economy. The Chinese they've run way faster, for whatever reasons. I mean, I'm not discussing it here now. We may eventually discuss it. But what we need to understand in 1991, therefore, was that the government of India diagnosed the crisis, but it didn't diagnose it by itself. It went to the World Bank and IMF for help with the balance of payments because of all the points I mentioned, the global crisis and oil prices and so on. So it was told to change its policies. And this is the major structural adjustment program that was imposed by the World Bank and IMF, acting on behalf of the rich countries, of course, but essentially delivering it to the government of India. And so it's all apparently formally democratic. Government of India does all this. But what was the narrative? The narrative was the following. That India was facing a twin crisis. That you had a huge balance of payments crisis that arose from the excessive demand for imports in relation to your capability to export. So one decision that the IMF would typically insist in such cases, and so would the World Bank, would be devaluation of your currency so that your exports become cheaper in foreign currency terms. In fact, a World Bank report of October 1990 specifically suggested a two-step devaluation in the Indian economy, Indian rupee, by 22%. From the then existing value vis-a-vis the US dollar. And exactly that was what was carried out by the Manmohan Singh regime when Manmohan Singh was finance minister. in 1991. More or less almost identical steps. And the theory here is that if you devalue the rupee, your export becomes cheaper, it will expand and so on, and it will give you foreign exchange. And gradually, as you get out of the rigid trade regime and open up the economy, your prospects of selling goods and services abroad will improve dramatically. And in order to enable that to happen, you have to invite foreign capital, give them good conditions, encourage them, incentivize them. So one leg of the structural adjustment program was incentivizing foreign investors so that they can actually produce and export from India, making India kind of a global hub for certain classes of exports. This is a dream. It never happened ultimately. But this is a dream that was being sold at that time. So this is one part. So if you wanted to do that, then you have to liberalize vis-a-vis foreign capital. If you want to liberalize vis-a-vis foreign capital, you can't leave your domestic players behind. They also want liberalization, right? So we embarked upon a set of policies known as liberalization, privatization, and globalization. LPG policies for short. Not liquefied petroleum gas, but liberalization, privatization, and globalization. What did these terms mean? But here, liberalization means taking steps that cut people's subsidies. So you may not want liberalization here. We want a liberal government. The term has different meanings. So the better term would have been deregulation, but this has become part of the vocabulary. So LPG policies, or as I would say, deregulation, privatization, globalization. So let's understand each of these terms. Before I do that, let me also come back to the second of the two features of the crisis. One was the balance of payments. The other was what was called the fiscal crisis of the state. The state had no resources to spend on various things that were needed to be done. Education, healthcare, infrastructure. But government did not have the resources. Now, why government didn't have the resources was something that was never widely discussed. But of course, the basic point is that the ability of the government in India to tax the rich has always been very limited. First, its numbers are small. But even allowing for that, they have quite a lot of wealth. There's no wealth tax in the country, by the way. Zero wealth tax. Even in the days it existed, there was hardly anything collected. But now formally, we have no wealth tax at all. We have no inheritance tax at all. In a country of gross, obscene, indecent inequality, we don't have wealth tax or estate duty. We have only income tax. And income tax rates on paper can be high, but in de facto terms, with all the exemptions, they can be quite small. So India had very limited, the Indian state, given its closeness to the very powerful captains of industry, was generally very reluctant to tax the large private corporate sector. So their contribution to India's taxes was quite marginal. Bulk of the taxes come, as I said earlier, from indirect taxes that ordinary people pay when they buy things. Of course, income taxes of salaried people and so on, all that comes in. The government also gets money from people who invest in government paper, bonds, and so on, and saving certificates, etc., etc., etc. So, provident funds. So, in any event, at the end of the day, the government's mobilized resources were very inadequate in relation to what the government was required to do for the economy in terms of expenditure. And so this fiscal crisis, in the understanding of the World Bank and the IMF, was because of the failure of the government to restrain domestic demand. What it must do is reduce incomes going to working people. The farmers and the workers should not be enabled to demand goods and services. In that case, available goods and services will be quite adequate. Inflation can be controlled. And at the same time, the exports can be continued to be encouraged. If exports are not encouraged, then domestic consumption is prioritized, then you've got a balance of payments problem. So even the BOP problem was seen as a reflection of the failure of the government to impose sufficient restriction on the consumption of the masses in order to limit demand to what is available as supply. And therefore, the problem of the fiscal deficit was bound together with the problem of the balance of payments deficit, and then modeled in a way that suggested that the one is linked to the other. And so government had to tackle both at once. And the strategy for tackling that was to do the LPG. Now we can go back and ask what the LPG was. What is the meaning of those terms? Well, liberalization basically meant, or deregulation basically meant, removal of all restrictions on large private capital, domestic and foreign. Small guys were never really in the frame, although the legislations would often invoke the poor small guy who can't set up a shop because of all the bureaucracy, Tahsildar and the VA and all of that. So this will be invoked in order to delegitimize government. But in point of fact, the deregulation legislations were primarily aimed at helping the really large players. Large Indian players were relatively small by international standards, and of course the large international players. There's a bit of a tug of war there between the two, but that is a subsidiary battle. So the logic was, you must deregulate. To deregulate, you release animal spirits and energies of the entrepreneurs of India. And the images of a small guy, fresh, young, newly minted B.Tech from IIT Madras, full of verve and energy, starting a setup. But that's not the reality. That's the image. But the deregulation especially worked for the big guys, very big guys. And the second element was privatization. Now, what did that mean? Now, privatization can mean many things, you see. And there are two distinct senses in which privatization has to be seen. One is a more popular disinvestment by government of its shares in government-owned enterprises. This is disinvestment in the popular sense. Everybody understands that. Your government wants to disinvest in LIC of India or in the ONGC or SAIL or whatever, or BHEL for that matter. And of course, wants sometimes outright sell off something like a very profitable Bharat Petroleum to the monopolist in the petrochemical industry, the Reliance. So that's all sorts of things that kind of been happening, but already been talked about. But the basic logic here is privatization in the sense of government pulling out of business and disinvesting so that private players have more economic space. Remember, private, keyword is private, not your grocery shop owner, not your neighborhood street cart fellow, but very big guys, they are the private sector, right? And their global counterparts who are even bigger, they are to benefit from this legislation. That's the idea. So privatization is providing more economic space to the private sector by disinvesting government enterprises and handing over their assets to the private sector, who can then run them directly in some cases. But there is a very important sense. First of all, okay, this is important. I mean, this investment of private enterprises, which is now more or less not even questioned by many people, the logic of it, is something we have to look at. Because what does it mean? It means that you want to sell off publicity enterprise shares. Why are you doing that? Because you think that you need money. The guy who is buying it, he's no fool. He knows he can make money with it. So if he can make money with it, why is the government not able to make money with it? Is it just inefficiency? No. When there is a public sector enterprise, there are certain social obligations. There are certain basic labor practices it has to follow. But now they're trying to get rid of all these constraints even for the public sector by basically eliminating all labor laws and putting in some codes which captains of industry would love. That will happen, we don't know, but the legislation has been passed in a truncated parliamentary session, but that's a different matter. Now, here what you have then is the second aspect of the 3 points: deregulation, privatization. Privatization has a second aspect. apart from this selling of illicit assets and handing over control to the private players who want to maximize profits. Which means all the other goals that the public sector is serving is no longer relevant and not considered. The other sense of privatization, which is important to understand, is that sectors or areas or domains which have so far been considered the responsibility of the state now become privatized. Meaning, state no longer has an obligation to provide education, healthcare, and infrastructure for ordinary people. Now, in this sense, privatization is far more important than just the selling off of one or another company. So what this says is, we will now leave investments to be made in health, education, and infrastructure to private players. They will make those investments which are profitable, and they will charge rates for services provided at rates that help them maximize profits. All well and good, but what does it mean? It means that a lot of poor people will no longer be able to have access to healthcare or education or elementary infrastructure, because all these will be costed to provide maximization of profits for the large corporate entities which are going to be investing in these sectors. They may not invest in nursery schools, although sometimes nursery schools can be good business at a local level, but they're obviously looking at universities, colleges, picking up, business schools, and of course, all the rest of it. So, what privatization therefore means is the state abdicating its responsibility to provide health, education, and animal infrastructure to the people of India. It's a solemn constitutional obligation. The other point of privatization is, of course, the concept that the state will cede a lot of space to the private sector, which can then operate in a logic driven only by profit maximization. All of this will improve, it will mean considerable reduction of access to education, healthcare, and elementary infrastructure for ordinary people. And that's the consequence that we have to keep in mind. Now, these are all pros and cons, right? So the third element of LPG policies is, of course, globalization. And again, this comes in two forms. One is freeing up trade, okay? Removing restrictions on imports and exports and import liberalization, removal of quantity limits. Of course, a lot of pressure for this came from international agencies. I had mentioned to you that from 1985 onwards, there was this negotiations going on at the, what used to be called the GATT, General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade. It was now becoming, between 85 and 96, 95, it became, through a process of negotiations, the World Trade Organization, which was born in 1995. But in this process, pressure was brought upon countries to deregulate international trade and remove limits on imports. At best, they could levy some customs and import duties, but they could not put any ban on imports, nor even any regulations on the maximum quantity of a good that can be imported in any particular period. So, removal of quantity restrictions on imports, general lowering of tariffs, removal of all non-tariff barriers to trade, all these were part of the agenda of the World Trade Organization discussion and final agreement. So by the mid-90s, this was also coming. So our liberalization proceeded in steps. And so the liberalization part, in terms of globalization, LPG, globalization part, was partly on this question of trade and removal of restrictions, and that has happened in a very, very large measure in India. We have practically very few trade restrictions now. and practically no quantity restrictions. But the trade is only one part of the international trade regime, international economic regime. The other much more important part, especially with the rise of finance capital, is of course capital flows, financial flows across country borders. And this has been the most important demand, as we saw last time, of the advanced countries. They want freedom to move the capital from anywhere to anywhere at a moment's notice, and without being impeded or hampered by government regulations. So free mobility of capital as finance across country borders is the single most important demand and slogan of international finance capital. And that's what they've got now with India and other countries. And so what we have now is opening up the economy to unregulated inflows and outflows of capital as finance. Now, this is a very different proposition from inviting foreign capital to come and invest in manufacturing or some other economic activity. This is allowing foreign agents, economic agents, to bring foreign exchange into this country, convert it into rupees, play the stock market or the commodity market or any other speculative economic activity, does not create any output, does not provide any great employment, does not bring in new technology of any kind, and therefore is pretty useless from a macroeconomic point of view. But nonetheless, the incentive to invite them is here. So once they're here, they'll make their money and they'll exit. But you are supposed not to put any obstacles in their way because you are keen to attract foreign investment, because this is seen as a factor for economic growth. Now, it's a very ironic situation because once you have deregulated your imports and exports, and since you are a relatively vulnerable developing economy, your imports far exceed your exports. So you're running up a large trade deficit, which can only be partially remedied by, let's say, a net surplus in exports of services like IT-enabled services, and by inward remittances of Indians living abroad. But these are never enough. So you still have a permanent current account deficit in the balance of payments. In the balance of payments, you have got, first of all, what is called a merchandise trade account, only dealing with cross-border trade in goods alone. So if the export value of the goods you export is less than the import value of the goods you import, then you have a merchandise trade deficit. But India has been very high consistently throughout the last 30 years, around sometimes very high, around 10% of GDP, often 6, 7, 8%. Now, as against a very large trade deficit, a merchandise trade deficit, we have some net surplus on exports of services, IT-enabled services, tourism, etc. So you may get a small surplus there, which partly goes to meet the gap in the balance of trade in goods, or what is called the merchandise balance of trade. But then you have a second, possibility of Indians living abroad sending home money, workers and others, mostly workers. The others send their money to Swiss banks, but workers send it home. In any event, that is also not enough. So you end up with a permanent current account gap in the balance of payments. After you factor in, starting with the trade deficit, you factor in the surpluses on service sector remittances, you still end up with a deficit called current account deficit, which in India's case has been varying from 2% to sometimes even as high as 6% of GDP, very, very high. So this puts you in a vulnerable position. But why is this recommended then? It is recommended because of the understanding that if you open up the Indian economy and allow free movement of foreign capital, some of it may go into speculation, but others will come into manufacturing and other productive activities. So ultimately, if you provide adequate incentives, foreign capital will come and invest in India's development, along with domestic big capital. So this is the logic behind the LPG policy. And if you adopt LPG policies, you open up the Indian economy, deregulate all along the line, and government sits back and steps back and just is there to provide a helping hand to big industry and big capital. They will do all the investments. The animal spirits will be encouraged and they will do all the investment and put India into a regime of high growth. This is the narrative behind the LPG policies, blaming all earlier growth experience on controls and rigidities and so on, but never looking at the fact that the Western world was simply not interested in India till the 80s. Very marginally. Okay, so 1991, these three elements of policy, deregulation or liberalization, privatization and globalization, came to be pushed very, very hard. Partly initially, it was said this is because of the pressures applied by the World Bank and the fund to whom we have gone for loans. But gradually, as the Manmohan Singh regime, Narasimha Rao Manmohan Singh regime stabilized itself, we began to articulate these new policies, LPG policies, as being desirable in themselves and not as being those imposed by World Bank and the fund. And therefore, the logic there was, if you follow these policies, then you will attract a lot of investment, and that will lead to expansion of the economy and therefore to more employment. Everybody ultimately will become non-poor. So economic growth through foreign and domestic big investments will gradually take care of everybody. There will be trickle down even to the poor. So ultimately we will eliminate poverty and there will be massive and productive employment all around. So these were the narratives put forward for pursuing LPG policies. It was partly imposed on you by bank and fund initially, but later you justified it, rationalized it, saying this is good. But essentially what they mean is removal of all norms of accountability from private players. They can do whatever they want. And in fact, if you go after them for violating the law, that is seen as bad signals to international capital. The international capital becomes reluctant to come here. So essentially you are saying that let them be, don't ask questions. Don't try to even collect taxes from them. If they pay taxes well and good, if not, let it go. They are actually contributing to output by employing people and so on. This is the narrative, right? This is why you have the Vodafone case and this and that, and the other case, so on, all the Mauritius rooted investments, taking advantage of tax agreements. But what is the long and short of this? Well, 30 years on, we can make a rough assessment of the story, whether the claims made for LPG policies, they would encourage foreign investment and also much larger domestic investment and therefore propel growth, therefore propel employment and reduction of poverty and all of that. Has that been justified? And the short answer is mostly no. Mostly. There's been growth, no doubt. I mean, I think everyone must recognize that the rate of growth of GDP has remained at about maybe 6.5% through most of this period. But I'll deal with that in great detail. The growth story I'll deal with immediately after this. But you can't say that there's any spectacular breakthrough in growth rates. But even sustaining of a growth rate of 6% over 30 years is not an unimpressive achievement. So one can give credit for that. But the question to ask is, what was the performance in terms of other aspects? Employment, poverty reduction, and any kind of strengthening of India's self-reliance. Did India really begin to export much more than it imported? Were we getting a balance of trade surplus? No. So, did we create more employment? In fact, the rate of growth of employment in the period 1991 to now is much less impressive than the rate of growth of employment between 1983 and 1990. The national sample survey figures for 1983 and 1994 tell us that the 10 years there, the employment rate grew much faster. But post that, growth of employment has been quite small. And in recent times, it's been worse. It's been negative practically. So employment did not economically, and certainly whatever employment there is what you could call precarious employment on very insecure terms, where you could be kicked out any time. We'll keep talking about the need for legislation, to enable hire and fire. But there's no hire. Hiring is not banned by anybody. So when they say hire and fire, what they mean is fire and fire. But it looks nicer if we say hire and fire. It makes it look very even and fair and all that. But the de facto thing is, you're basically asking for freedom to kick out people. And that's the essence of labor policy. Not just here, but across the world, there is a compulsion to make labor markets more flexible and so on and so forth. Now, in the Indian context, what we'll do in the coming lectures is to look at the track record of the Indian economy in relation to the claims made by the advocates of LPG policies. One thing, however, should be mentioned here itself. Even the LPG policy supporters kept saying that no, you should open up the economy, remove regulations and so on. It is not that there was no merit in that. There were some regulations which needed to be removed. But the enthusiastic narrative was a bit too unrealistic, to be polite. And many of the expectations did not materialize. Because the liberalizers themselves realized this, and they, of course, came up with additional arguments as to why liberalization is necessary. And they were saying, look, what is the point of just opening it up? After all, these guys can go anywhere in the world. Why should they come to India? So not only must you open up, not only must you allow them to come in, but you must offer them extra incentives, like lower tax rates, like no questions asked on sources of funds, etc., etc. So, if you did follow that logic, India did in fact do that, and offered lower tax rates. Then the moment you offer lower tax rates to the international players, you have to offer it to your domestic players. And if you offer it to both international and domestic big players, then the government revenues will suffer. So where do you cut? So you cut expenditures on welfare programs for the poor, for the ordinary working people. Notice that the Western countries apply this very selectively. They provide massive subsidies to their farmers. Whereas here in India, we have people saying, no, why subsidies? Cut it out. Cut out the electricity subsidy. Cut everything out. Now, of course, they all want their subsidies, but the ones for the farmers has to go. This is how a lot of the elite in this country think. But in reality, it's been difficult to buy this argument because poor are in no country in the world does the government not provide support to agriculture. Remember, agriculture is different from industry. It is dependent on the vagaries of nature, and therefore it's far more risky than plain manufacturing industry. So it's important, therefore, to recognize this and recognize that liberalization proponents did not stop just at liberalization. They wanted the government to provide better, treatment to big business, what is now called ease of doing business. That's we get so happy if we move up a couple of places in the ease of business ranking across the world, without asking what are the consequences for people of such easing of business restrictions or legislation. So some red tape can obviously be cut, but not all red tape. No, there are security considerations, there are other considerations. Now we are throwing everything to the wind. It's a desperate move because China is going faster, and especially post recent development, we are now politically getting increasingly closer to the camp of the rich countries, US, Australia, and Japan in the Asian region, becoming part of the Quad, set up to essentially counter China. This whole narrative has taken on a different political dimension altogether. Whatever the merits of it, I'm not going into the merits of it, but I'm just saying, pointing out that from day one, 1991 onwards, we not only opened up the economy for foreign capital to come into and leave India at will without necessarily having to invest productively in this country. We not only did that, we also offered them incentives. And in order to ensure that domestic capital was also on board, we had to extend those incentives to them as well. And once we had done both these things, government was left with less revenue than expected. Therefore, they had to cut back on essential public expenditure in health, education, infrastructure. So that is why you will see that in the period of the reforms, the total subsidies going to food, fertilizer, and energy as a share of GDP has actually been declining. Meanwhile, government is funding expenditures not by taxation but primarily by borrowing. It is cutting back expenditure but borrowing still. And that has led to, of course, a rise in the proportion of interest payments on account of interest and debt to private players in India by the government of India. Those interest payments now account for something like nearly 4% of GDP. Subsidies for the ordinary people account for less than about 1.5% of GDP, but the interest payments to the rich, because they are the ones who buy government paper and government certificates and all that, not the poor, has gone up to 4% of GDP. So it's a very unequal kind of bargain. Anyway, what we can do is to examine the track record in terms of growth. That's one index, one indicator, growth of GDP. Second, we can look at it in terms of the employment picture. Third, we can look at the impact of these reforms and the growth process on poverty alleviation. And then you can look at possibly other aspects of the economy, including inequalities, various kinds, and regional class, caste. One important implication, for example, of privatization, which you don't think about, when you discuss privatization, you don't think about this, is that in the absence of reservation in the private sector, process of privatization essentially destroys the access to reservation that the socially oppressed sections have enjoyed in this country. OBC or SC or ST. Once enterprises become privatized, they will no longer be obliged to follow the norms of reservations. And this is true for education institutions, manufacturing enterprises, healthcare providers, everybody you can think of. So, there's a huge social implication of privatization, which in a state like Tamil Nadu, where people are more sensitive to social issues, is understood. But what would be the fate of people in a state like UP, I will leave it to you to imagine. This is a difficult country for the poor and for the socially oppressed. Maybe a good country for some of us. I'm not doing too badly. I'm a retired professor. I'm having enough of a pension. But the bulk of the ordinary people is a difficult country. And it's become more difficult with the developments in the economy in the last 30, 40 years. But balanced to some extent by growth as well as by technological advances. So life is livable in that sense. I mean, you can't say, oh, those times are better, old times are better. No, I would never say that. I say we are making progress in some way, but the bulk of the progress is by. That's the theme that we keep finding. So before I close for the day, I have another 10, 12 minutes, right? 11:30. Let me just spell out the growth first. Now, let me also first of all make the point that the period from 1991 till now cannot be seen as uniform. It is not uniform. There are different distinct phases. Economic policies have subtly changed. And economic outcomes have also been different in different phases. So the first broad classification I would make is that you have one period from 1991 till 1998, for 6-7 years, when the reforms are still being contested. Damage is not immediately evident. There are other factors at work. This is the first phase. The phase of very rapid globalization in terms of the foreign trade regime, because we're signing a WTO and all that. But in terms of internal economic policies, there's still a lot of push and pull between the poor and the government on benefits the poor from economic growth. People are fighting for their little share of the pie. Then you have a phase from 1998 till 2004, which is a very difficult period for India. By far, I would say the worst period in the reforms period before 2014. Take from 1990 to 2014. The period from 1998 to 2004, which happens to coincide with the 1-year and 5-year NDA regimes under late Prime Minister Vajpayee. That's a political coincidence, but it had to do with international developments as well as national development. That difficult period of 1998 to 2004. Then you have a revival of the economy in 2004, which goes on, in spurts, not uniform, not consistent, but up and down, till about 2010-11. And then the economy begins to tank in 11, 12, 12, 13, 13, 14 especially. And then since then, it becomes more difficult to talk about the economy, because in the period 2014 till now, the most major damage that has happened to the Indian economy for analysts is the credibility of the data pushed by the government, published by the government. This has become a serious casualty. Government has been either reluctant to publish data or has often manipulated data, or has completely sidetracked issues by offering other data which are not germane to the problem at hand. Of course, you saw this dramatically in terms of the employment and unemployment data. You're also seeing it in terms of the consumer expenditure data, which has been not discussed at all widely. And you have this whole attempt to substitute perceptions for reality in the last several years. So that's a separate, distinct reality with data. So what I will do now is I will talk about 1991 to 2014 as one single narrative, although within that there are sub-periods, especially in relation to the agrarian crisis. Then I will look at 2014 to 20 as a distinct phase. And within that, of course, the current pandemic phase has its own distinct features. But before I do all that, today what I will do is I will just set out the main issues for us to look at. So like I said, we will look at growth. And here the picture is the following. From 1991 to now, for the last 30 years, if you look at the overall numbers, you would probably say that the growth rate in the last 30 years is not statistically different from the growth rate in a decade from 81 to 1991. Roughly about 6%, maybe 6.25, something of that order of magnitude, which, as I said, is quite impressive, but it still is a far cry from the claims of 8% and 9% and so on that various governments have made over the years, including the ones that came earlier and, of course, the present one also. So it's a very sobering thought that the overall growth rate in the reform period has been broadly no different from that of the preceding decade of the 1980s. At the same time, this is impressive in terms of sustaining growth at 6% over a 40-year period. That's quite impressive, historically speaking. But what has been the impact of the growth on different sections of the population, that's a different story. Well, I will separate that. The second thing we can talk about, we look at growth rates in each period, but we look at also at the major concern, politically also, is only significant. That's the agrarian crisis. What is the nature of the agrarian crisis, if any, in India? And how can it be resolved? Or reforms encouraging corporate takeover of agriculture the way forward? Or do we need to look at more fundamental structural reforms in agriculture like land reforms? And like providing much greater support to the small and marginal farmers from the state through all kinds of initiatives, including cooperativization and cooperative farming, and all that. So there's a whole set of issues there, with the role of public investment and agriculture, etc. So we'll discuss agriculture, agrarian crisis, maybe one lecture. We'll look at the employment picture. That'll also be maybe not a whole lecture, but a good part of a lecture might be taken up with looking at the employment numbers. I don't know how much we get to do, because there is a time constraint. So leaving that aside, I would say that the first 1992-2014 phase can be divided, as I said, to three sub-phases: 91-98, 98-2004, 2004-2014. And in each of these phases, the prime features change a bit. In the first 91-98, there's pretty much significant growth of services, followed by industry, but agriculture doesn't do so well. But that's quite disastrous, or marginal. It's much worse for 98-2004, where agriculture does quite badly. That's when the real crisis of agriculture bursts out in the form of hundreds of thousands of farmers committing suicide, which people like P. Sainath have written extensively about. There's a lot of narration on that. And a lot of, I would recommend that you go to his PARI, P-A-R-I, PARI online website. It's the people of rural India, basically. And it's a very useful site to go to. There are other sites. The Foundation for Agrarian Studies has a website called FAS, Foundation for Agrarian Studies.org.in. FAS.org.in. That's a very good site where a lot of material in agriculture is available. So if you're taking that as a key subject for your mains, that'll be a good place to go, a good resource page. Anyway, so the 98-2004 is particularly bad for agriculture. 91-98 is not so bad, but it's worse than 80s. 80s is the golden decade for agriculture. It falls off in 91-98. It gets much worse in 98-2004 on account of both domestic and international developments. And then you come into the next period where agriculture revives a bit, but not consistently. And there are specific political factors at work which force government at the center to pay greater attention to agriculture and to undertake public investment in irrigation and infrastructure so as to help agriculture. And that has to do with the fact that the government at the center becomes dependent for its survival on support of the left political parties from outside. So they push pro-farmer, pro-peasant, pro-worker reforms in the government. In the current against the ongoing neoliberal reform. So that's an interesting period. But that doesn't last very long, because by 2008, the political left has fallen out of the government. The government is back to its neoliberal trajectory fully. And then it's also rocked by the global economic crisis of 2008, followed by a slow recovery, again impacted by a severe drought in 2009-10, all of which makes this period rather checkered. See, in that sense, the 2004-2014 period has some impressive numbers in terms of growth and to some extent, food security, etc. But it also has many ups and downs. And partly because of their own policies, partly because of unforeseen developments, such as the global economic crisis. Then we are as I said, the more recent 2014 to 19, and then post 2019, the pandemic phase of the economy. So let's see how it goes, but I will look for each of these phases. I look at broad indicators. One is growth rates of GDP, which to me, the GDP growth rate is a useful indicator, but not a tell-all indicator. It can be quite misleading because of the way it's measured and so on. It does not say anything about distribution and who benefits and who loses. And the numbers themselves are increasingly less credible than they used to be. The last few years, like many other institutions which are getting eroded, the statistical system has also got eroded in the last several years. That's an important issue that we're dealing with. It's not a, compared to many other countries, it's a better system, but like all wings of bureaucracy and the state, including other estates like the media or judiciary or whatever. Everything today is strongly impacted by larger political processes, shall we say. And something we can't do much about, but we can discuss it maybe at a time. So what I'll do next time, I will discuss very quickly in the next lecture the growth performance of the economy and its impact on things like poverty. Then we'll maybe take one lecture on agriculture and agrarian crisis. And then finally, we'll wrap up in the last lecture with more recent developments. I'm hoping that we can manage that. Let's see how it goes. Okay, I'm going to end my lecture now. And I do see that people are writing in questions. So what I will do is I will try and respond to that at some point. Perhaps not today, but later. I mean, the difficulties with this format is very difficult to, without seeing the persons involved, the body language is so important in terms of responding to questions. But yeah, we can take a question and then be done. Yeah.
Thank you, sir. Thank you, sir.
Thank you. Any questions? No.
No, sir.
Okay. So we meet on this, I think, next meeting is on 7th, right? Whatever. Okay. Bye.